It is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer King, Director of Consumer Privacy at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society.
Yes.
We will forgive her for having headed south down to Stanford. But you probably don't know this, but I've known Jen since she was in the master's program here. She worked with me over at the law school, came back to do her PhD, and so Jen and I have been collaborating for 14 years. I think Nancy has known her as long, so it is really a great pleasure to see her give this talk today. And I want to thank Coy Cheshire for being here as well, her co-advisor. And Jen is going to be discussing the findings of her dissertation research, where she took a novel approach to trying to understand consumers' decisions about disclosing information using the framework of social exchange theory. And Jen's work, I think, is really poised to bring some more rigorous thinking to conversations about trust, conversations about the relational nature of data and decisions to disclose it. And so I'm really thrilled to have her here today, and we look forward to seeing her back up here now that she's undertaking new research. So take it away, Jen. Thank you.
All right.
You don't need this mic'd, right?
I mic'd. Can you all hear me? Gary, am I good? Okay. Here, I'll use my clicker. Okay, so as I think all of you know, or almost all of you know, I'm Jen King. So I am a privacy researcher with a background in human-computer interaction and social computing. I have been researching information privacy for almost 15 years, so entirely with Deirdre. With a large number of those years spent here at the iSchool. And so I'm going to walk you through my dissertation research today, which, as Deirdre mentioned, focuses on an area of information privacy that I felt was pretty understudied, which is probably the uniting theme behind all dissertations. How social structures affect why we disclose personal information to companies. And so I'm going to go through, so the name of the dissertation is Privacy, Disclosure, and Social Exchange Theory. What I did was a mixed method study, a combination of qualitative interviews and an experimental survey. So I'm going to walk you through the study design, the findings, and the outcomes. And I finished all of this work this past May. I have my degree, so you can't take it from me. At least I hope not. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to this area. So over the past decade, I and other private scholars have been seeking to understand why people choose to disclose their personal information to companies, even in the face of privacy threats and risks. So there are many suggested responses to this question. So some argue that the threats and risks themselves are just overblown. Others argue that people don't care about privacy. Others have suggested that there's a privacy paradox, which is what this slide is about. This divergence between what people say they care about and what they actually do in practice. In my own research over the past decade, I've heard firsthand that most people really do care about their privacy. Few, though, are happy with the current status quo. Feel as if they have no control over their personal information, but in order to get the access to the online services they want and they need, in many cases they need, it's not just an option, many feel that as if they have no choice other than to agree to the terms and conditions they are offered and just hope for the best. So this dissertation is my attempt to dig into this proposition from a different perspective. To answer these questions about why people disclose, researchers have focused on a range of possibilities. So the influence of the actual interface when you're looking at different types of software, the impact of privacy policies, the influence of social media sites. I mean, these are just a few. I can name many, many, many more. When I surveyed this work in planning out the dissertation, what I found lacking was an accounting of social structure and how this might impact personal disclosure. And so we don't make our disclosure decisions in a vacuum. So already, the research community has acknowledged the importance of social context as a crucial aspect of evaluating privacy. Incorporating context has taken us from a world where privacy just equals secrecy to one where we acknowledge that people's privacy expectations are contextually dependent. Information I share with a friend is revealed with a certain expectation of discretion. Simply because I've shared it does not mean that I expect it to become public. So by accounting for social structure, I take what's called a relational approach meaning that I examine an individual's personal disclosure to a company by identifying the form of the relationship between the two parties. And I will explain this in more depth in a few minutes, but I used a theory from sociology, social exchange theory, as the framework for this research. And with social exchange theory, we can make empirically tested predictions about how actors will behave in an exchange relationship. And it also provides a way to understand the influence of power differentials in exchange relationships. So the pictures on this slide are, I would say, much more kind of intimate relationships than what I discovered in this research, but I'll tell you, it's hard to find images that depict a relationship with a company. But tattooing a company's logo on your body is, you definitely have a relationship with that company in some form. And that's all I'll say on that one. So this dissertation was a 2-year project. And as I survey current thinking about technology platforms, the one thing that comes clear to me is that the public in general has become concerned about the amount of power that big companies hold over our lives. So earlier this year, when the Federal Trade Commission put out a call for comment asking for input as to what they should prioritize in the near future when thinking about privacy, regulation, and enforcement, one of the key issues on their dockets were concerns about antitrust and whether they should be considering examining large companies as monopolies. So one of my primary findings is that power imbalances and relationships between individuals and companies does have an effect on individual decisions to disclose personal information. And my fundamental argument is that by incorporating a social structural approach into studies of privacy and disclosure, that will provide us a fuller perspective as to why people make the choices they do and potentially explain behaviors that otherwise to date we've considered paradoxical. So I'm going to give you a very, very quick overview of social exchange theory. Very quick. Social exchange theory is, as I said earlier, a theory from sociology. It was developed throughout the 1950s, 1970s, primarily by George Homans, Peter Blau, and Richard Emerson. And I have a quote from Richard Emerson up there. The exchange approach in sociology might be described for simplicity as the economic analysis of non-economic social situations. And so just gonna try to give you enough so that you understand what I'm talking about through this talk. The core principles are that resources of value, and in this case, I'm talking about information, are exchanged between 2 or more actors. That exchange relations develop in structures of mutual dependence. And what that means is that there is some reason why you are exchanging these things with somebody else. Okay, so you both value whatever it is you're exchanging. That the actors engage in recurrent, mutually contingent exchanges with specific partners over time. So this isn't so much about like a one-shot trade with somebody. These are relationships that you're building where you're exchanging one thing or another repeatedly. And the valued outcomes obey the psychological principle of satiation, meaning that there's some logic to what you're doing. You're not trading it for the sake of trading it. You're trading it because it has value to you, and you're not just going to trade it because it's, for fun, essentially. And there are 3 primary forms of exchange. One of the ones that most of us are probably the most familiar with is what's called reciprocity, the reciprocal exchange. And that's an informal mode of exchange such that I could say, hey, I have these great oranges in my backyard. Koi, will you share them with me for the apples you have? Sure. We basically make exchanges, but there's not a lot of negotiation and planning and thought. It's just based on kind of reciprocal needs. The form I'm going to focus today is direct negotiated exchange, and that is one where you actually are kind of making a plan and making an agreement about what you're going to exchange, and there are expectations about what you're going to receive in return. It's not, it's planned, and often it is actually negotiated, although I'll talk more about how in this case, the cases I'm looking at, there's actually not really a negotiation process. Generalized exchange is more of the form of I contribute to a pool of something with this expectation that I might get something back from it, but it's not going to go directly necessarily to me. Like I'm doing something for a better good, and I might derive a benefit from it, but I'm not doing it to get a direct benefit immediately. Okay. So again, the form of exchange, and this is the last slide on this topic that I'm focusing on in the study, is direct negotiated exchange, and I put binding in parentheses because it's kind of a question of whether it is or not, and I'll talk more about that. So in direct negotiated exchange, the outcome is negotiated such that there's a clear expectation or agreement between the 2 actors about what the outcome will be. So it's not like, I'm going to give you oranges, and you go, oh, I have backyard honey I'm going to give you. Great. It's that I'm going to give you my personal information. You're going to give me a DNA test. And we have a clear expectation about what's going to happen. Risk and uncertainty are mediated by the negotiation process. So we take out some level of uncertainty because we're making these agreements with each other. Trust, whether it's institutional or interpersonal, is not a primary feature of the relationship, meaning that we're not making this based on our personal kind of feelings we've made about each other. We're engaging in these exchanges because there are assurances that work to control for the risk and uncertainty of making the exchange. So assurances are defined as mechanisms that provide assurance, which include legal or normative authorities that impose sanctions for violations of agreements or failure to fulfill one's obligations. In this study, I looked at two forms of assurances: formal assurances, which I describe as laws, privacy policies, contracts, and informal assurances. And those are more things such as one's reputation or a company's reputation, the visual design of a website and how that imparts some form of assurance to people. Recommendations, whether they're personal or through like an app store, for example. And anonymity, I stumble on that word, anonymity, my apologies, which works as a structural assurance, meaning I'm giving data to somebody because I'm assuming I'll be anonymous and that I won't be identified. That's assuring me, it's taking the risk out of that. Another feature of negotiated, or actually all exchange relations, but is power. Power is the potential that derives from the structural relations among actors. And basically, how power is articulated in theory is that power is your dependency on another party for what you need. So exercises of power occur when one actor uses this potential to gain advantage in exchange or another. So if I need something and you control it, I am basically power dependent upon you. And so the fewer alternatives I have access to, then the more power you gain in that relationship. And I should note, if anybody has questions as we go through, I'm happy to take questions on small issues. Big picture questions, I'll take at the end. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into the study now. So first, as Deirdre mentioned, this was a fairly novel approach to looking at privacy. I did two pieces to the research. One was a qualitative research study where I performed 20 semi-structured interviews, and I interviewed 10 23andMe customers. So 23andMe is a genetic direct-to-consumer testing service, and 10 women who used pregnancy apps. And I decided I needed a mixed methods approach to this topic because there really wasn't anything like this in the literature, neither in privacy nor in social exchange. So I wanted to start by getting a sense of whether these concepts even made sense to people before I moved into an experimental piece. And so the experimental survey, I integrated some of the findings from the qualitative phase, and I created a vignette-based experiment with the goals of both measuring the effects of negotiation and then assurance structures on 4 dependent variables, which were trust, fairness, power, and privacy. So the main criteria for the qualitative piece in terms of identifying the context was I needed to find companies or services where the exchange relationships there was an undisputed exchange of personal information for access to a service. So with 23andMe, you spit in a vial, you send it into the company, and in return, you get a genotyping of your DNA. So you get to learn information about different health conditions, potentially your genealogical background. And we need to note that in this study, all of the people I interviewed were elective users. These were all people who decided they wanted to do this. And I think I would get some interesting results had I interviewed people who, for instance, would never engage in genetic testing, as well as potentially people who were considering it but hadn't done it yet. So these were all people who had already said, yes, absolutely, I'm on board. Also, I should note that these interviews were conducted in 2017, and there's been a lot of high-profile news articles since then on genetic testing, which I think also would potentially shift some of the respondent answers that I got, especially around privacy. And then for the 10 pregnancy app users, I didn't narrow it down to a specific app. I basically selected 5 or so, and I found women who were users of one of the 5 apps. And they use those apps basically to track different information about their pregnancies. Across all 20, I asked them about their primary search engine. And as it happens, a lot of people use Google. So 19 of my 20 participants were Google users, so this really became more of a discussion of Google than just about online search in general. Although I really tried to focus the questions just on the search aspect when we were discussing it and not on kind of the broader use of Google. This was a convenience sample. My participants were recruited from local email lists in Berkeley. I didn't know any of them. And as much as possible, I tried to diversify those samples by age and gender and race when I could. Although clearly in the pregnancy apps, they were all women. And then the participants were paid for their time, and I recorded and transcribed all of the interviews. So the primary goal of the qualitative study was to explore whether social exchange theory accurately and adequately captured the dynamic between individuals and companies. And then my secondary goal was, okay, if these are social exchange relationships, what form did they actually take? You know, were they reciprocal relationships? Were they the direct negotiated relationships? And so I had 3 hypotheses going into it. One is that the form of the relationship was actually a direct negotiated exchange, that assurances were present in these relationships, so they were potentially binding relationships, and that the form of the relationship did affect their disclosure choices. And so in addition to determining what the form of the relationship was, I also asked questions around power to get a sense of to what extent power differentials were features of the relationships and how it might affect them. I asked the participants about fairness and benefits. So what were their perceptions of what was fair and who they benefited or who they thought benefited from the relationship. And then questions about privacy and risk. What were their concerns? You know, what risks did they think about, and so on. And so I'm gonna go through the findings pretty quickly, although we're doing okay on time. So the first set I wanna go through are just questions about the nature of the relationship. So one of the things I asked them was a question along the lines of, describe your relationship to me. What do you offer them? What do they offer you? And as you'll see on these slides, I have a number of quotations from the participants in bold that are fun to read. And so what I found was that, yes, these were direct negotiated relationships. They were not reciprocal, even if they weren't actually negotiated. So what I'm talking about is that you basically accept a terms and conditions offer, if you want to even call it an offer, from the company, and you don't actually get to negotiate that. Or you also don't necessarily get to negotiate the information they collect. But for the most part, people did understand, to some extent at least, what these companies were offering them and what they were going to give them in return. Overall, across all 3 of the contexts, there was fairly low friction and low terms of commitment, although that really did vary by service. 23andMe had the highest amount of friction, meaning that you actually had to spit into the tube and send it in, and you also had to pay. But most people actually didn't find that sample to be particularly onerous because, as one person said, it's only spit. It's not blood, it wasn't anything more complicated. With pregnancy apps, those were definitely the lowest friction, in that for the most part, the women were only required to, at most, usually give their email address. And then at that point, the rest of the information they could give was optional. Although I should note that there is a lot of information that is tracked through mobile apps that they aren't necessarily aware of, but in terms of what they thought they were giving, it was generally just the email address. And so the participants' expectations about the relationship are really bounded by their mental models. And by that I mean that behavioral advertising has gotten, the feedback loop has gotten so short that most people tend to understand that if they do something like search for something online, they know that within minutes, sometimes literally a minute, they'll start getting ads for whatever it was they just searched for. And so most people at this point kind of get that, especially the pregnancy app users. As one said, I'm offering them data, and essentially I'm a statistic for their advertising numbers when they sell their ads. So to the extent that that's how the relationships function, people were mostly okay with that because it made sense, even if they don't like it. Like, okay, like you're using my interest in pregnancy to send ads to me, I get it. Like, it's not again, not ideal, but it's happened. And this was especially true with both the pregnancy app users and the 23andMe users as well, that having some form of negotiated power to control their disclosure really made people happier. I mean, it gave them a sense of agency. And that was mostly about opting in, or with the pregnancy apps, your ability to decide what information you were actually providing them or not. That made people feel like they had a lot more control over the relationship. So, fairness and benefits. So, some of the questions I asked were, do you feel you were treated fairly? What benefits did you get from the relationship, and what did the company get? With pregnancy apps, the users really thought that they were kind of getting away with something for nothing, and that most of them thought they got pretty good content for free, essentially, other than the cost they paid in terms of what they were actually, the ads they were seeing. Nancy?
I don't understand what these pregnancy apps do.
Oh, okay.
What people get from them.
So basically, it allows you to track different stats through your pregnancy, like your weight, what week you're in, do you need to see the doctor? You can track a tremendous amount of data, but mostly, like at the minimum, most women track what week, like what their due date is, and then maybe their weight.
Does it then give you information like you're in the 90th percentile?
Yes.
Or something like that?
Yes, that and a whole lot more. I mean, part of it's about convenience and helping you navigate pregnancy. Part of it's about what content you're getting. So you're in week 12. Your baby's as big as a lima bean. Was one of the popular tropes. Yes, so it's partially about like what, helping you navigate the pregnancy, and then you could use it for a lot. You could put in test results, you could put in, blood level lab results, if you're worried about gestational diabetes, like there's a lot you can do. But for the most part, the very minimum, it usually was just, who are you, what's your email address, and then what week are you in, when's your due date, and that was it. With 23andMe, this was actually one of the most fascinating parts of the whole study, in my opinion. There was a really interesting mix of what I call narcissism and altruism, in that people definitely benefit from using 23andMe. Again, I talked to an audience of enthusiastic users, and they were enthusiastic about the results they got, in that they really felt like they obtained something they just didn't have from any other source. At the same time, you have the option to also contribute your data, your genetic data, to their research efforts. And most people did that. Not all, but most of them did. And they also felt like that was a way of kind of helping society. So in social exchange terms, we call that an indirect generalized exchange. It's the idea that you're contributing to this body of research. You may or may not get something back, but most people were just really enchanted with the idea that they were helping advance science. And some of the quotes up there definitely speak to that. With online search, clearly people got benefits from just getting the search retrieval results back. And most people called it a fair trade. I gave them something. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but I got what I needed. I figured out how to get to the grocery store. Others were really concerned about whether the results were objective, which I thought was an interesting concern. And that was more that they were concerned that they weren't getting objective data, but that Google was potentially kind of misleading them or giving them data to manipulate them. And that mostly focused on basically sales, on making you buy something maybe you wouldn't normally want. And one of the things I should note too is with the genetic testing piece, this indirect generalized exchange, this like happiness that people got from contributing to the data pool, I would argue really minimized people's sense of risk. Like most people were so distracted, I would almost argue, from the idea that they were benefiting society that they really weren't kind of assessing the risks of participating. But I'll go more into that in a few minutes. Okay, so power and access to alternatives. So I asked people, do you feel like you're on equal footing with this company? Or does one of you have more power than the other? And so for the most part, people felt like the companies had more power than the individuals. In most cases, these imbalances are mitigated by providing the participants options and flexibility in the relationship. So, the more that people were given the leeway not to do something or to not disclose, kind of the more personally powerful they felt. And a sense of kind of unfairness was linked to feeling too known by the company, which in turn was actually tied to the length of the relationship. So I think it's important to note, with pregnancy apps, most women use them for only the length of their pregnancy and maybe a little before, a little after. So at most, you're usually engaging with these apps for a year, in one shot. 23andMe, it is kind of a one-shot deal. You send your sample in, you get the results back. But I did encounter people who had taken the test up to 5 or more years before. And so they were still engaged with the company, but just kind of occasionally. With Google, I had participants who'd been using Google for up to 20 years or more. I'd say both the youngest user and the user with the least experience with Google had been using it for 5. So at this point, a lot of us have very, very long histories in using Google for search. And so that knowledge of, wow, I've actually been using Google for 15 years, they know a lot about me. That really colored people's perception of both the power dynamic as well as that feeling like, they know a lot about me and they're starting to make kind of judgments or inferences about me in ways that go beyond what I described earlier, I searched for the shoes, I got the ad for the shoes. Like, why is it making these connections about me suddenly that it didn't used to? So that made people feel fairly uncomfortable. Also related to that was, with Google especially, the depth of the lock-in that people were engaged in, meaning that they're all usually using multiple Google services. So this idea that I could boycott them, for example. One person raised that, well, if I didn't like them, how would I boycott them? Like, they have my email, they have my calendar, they have my whole life, they have my phone. So like, getting out of that ecosystem would be a real challenge. And so that led to questions around, like, where do I stand in relation to them? Who has more power? They do. And then finally, assurances, actually not finally, second to next, assurances and trust. I asked people, what made you comfortable sharing your information with the app or 23andMe or your search provider? And who would you complain to if they did something that you didn't like or that you didn't trust? With pregnancy apps, those were usually obtained through an app store. And so the app store itself kind of offered people an assurance, whether it was through the ratings, the fact it was in the store itself, also things like the look and feel of the app. People thought it looked trustworthy or friendly. That made them feel assured. So the UI really has an influence. And also people made some interesting assumptions about what actually protected them. So with the pregnancy apps, because they are health related, but they are not medical related, I had one participant who said, yeah, I think HIPAA, which is the health privacy law, I think something like that protects my data when I disclose to this app, which it doesn't. It's not your doctor. So it's not protected by any health privacy laws. This is just one example, but there were several examples in the study of people going, I think this law does offer me something, and it turns out they were actually wrong, like there wasn't a law that protected them. With 23andMe, the design of the website actually made a huge impact on people in that it looked professional. The information was very clear. People felt like it was extremely high quality. At the time, several people mentioned their relationship with Google, 23andMe's relationship to Google, as an assurance. I'm not sure that would necessarily be the same a couple years later, because this was 2017, 16, 17. But that was definitely like, oh, well, I heard Google funded them, and so I think they're really, they're on the up and up. And the opt-in piece to 23andMe, the fact that if you wanted to share, you wanted to participate in their research, or if you wanted to share your results to look for other relatives on the relatives finding platform, because that was opt-in, people, again, felt assured by, oh, I'm not being forced to do anything, like this is great. Nothing's being forced on me. The other thing I'd mention is, unlike almost every other service, I did have a couple, at least one, I want to say 2 people read 23andMe's privacy policy, which is worth mentioning because it's so rare. And I think it's worth mentioning because it's such a new service, or it's a new paradigm of disclosure, that some people actually did stop to look at the privacy policy because unlike no one remembered looking at Google's privacy policy, for example, especially if they'd been a customer for 20 years. They had no idea when they'd last seen it. With search, so the fact that everybody used Google was kind of an assurance for many people. Again, the company's reputation circa 2016, I don't think they've been hammered as much as Facebook, but I think there is a larger sense in 2018 that the tech companies are maybe not our best friends. And again, this perceived transparency of the business model that, oh, I get it because I searched for the water bottle. Now I'm getting all these ads for water bottles. Yeah, I understand how they make their money. They're advertising at me when I do searches. Got it. And then this assumption of being anonymous, that they're not interested in me. They're only interested in me as a demographic category, or they're interested in me as a person in the Bay Area who wants to buy shoes. Like, it's not about me as a person at all. I get to hide in the database, I get this product for free, and that's what's happening. Of course, I think there are good reasons to question whether that is the current business model and where the business models are going, but to the extent that that is still happening, that's how people are making sense of this. Okay, finally, privacy. So I asked people, does how they handle your personal information meet your expectations? Or who else do you trust with the type of information that you give to this company, among other questions. So people voiced the greatest amount of concern with their search queries, which I will say surprised me. In part, I think because they had the longest relationships with the search companies. But they also thought search data, and remember, I asked all 20 participants about search. And universally, people thought the content of their searches were much, much more personal than either their genetic data or whatever they disclosed to the pregnancy app providers. And I think that is in part because those queries, especially aggregated over time, and if you've been a Google user for 15 years and you've never turned off your search history, they are there. You can go look. At least one person had done that and talked through me the experience, with me through the experience of having done it, and describing how, wow, it's both a time capsule into who I was, and also, this is horribly creepy. Like, my God, they know a lot about me. They know what I was doing one random night in 2014. And so I was surprised because as a privacy researcher, I assumed that DNA would be considered extremely private information. And again, these very willing users of 23andMe felt very differently. And I have a couple of really good quotes up there if you can read them while I'm talking, which is just this sense that, DNA, like I shed it everywhere. It's a bunch of, like the code itself is like a bunch of numbers and letters. It doesn't tell you about me. It doesn't tell you about my interior state. It doesn't tell you what I care about. Whereas search, that tells you what I'm worried about. That tells you the thing really going through my head. And I do think this is one of the reasons that this year, for example, when you look at like Facebook and how people have been very upset about Facebook disclosures, again, if you think about the Facebook data people share, it's qualitatively rich. It's my friends, it's what I care about at the time, it's my emotions, it's the things I'm saying I love or I hate. And I think that resonates with people far more than what happened this week. Marriott had a breach. So I don't know how many of you are Marriott hotel users, but are you gonna be personally affected by the Marriott breach? If you are, hopefully not, probably not, but but if your search queries get out there, that's a whole different ballgame. People were very concerned about that piece. Okay, so primary takeaways from the qualitative portion, and I'm gonna move on to the quant piece. So these relationships were in fact direct negotiated exchanges. They gave people with these clear benefits. The participants did observe power differentials between them and the companies they were engaged with. And those power dependencies definitely affected people's perceptions of how fair the relationship was to them. Assurances did enable disclosures of personal information, but from those, informal assurances dominated. So most people did not say, I feel great because I know there is a law protecting me. I mean, partially that's because in the US we have very few laws that would protect personal disclosures in most of these areas. And so for the most part, people were saying, I feel good because the website looks good, because my friends use it, because, I could complain about the company on Twitter. That was a very popular one too. I can basically affect the company's reputation. by using social media if I'm unhappy about something. For the most part, people really tried to disclose as little personal information as possible. There were multiple instances of people discussing strategies that they used to minimize what they were telling these companies. But really, there was a baseline assumption that they were anonymous, that the companies didn't care about them as individuals. It was all in the aggregate. Some people did articulate risks related to privacy, but for the most part, again, willing users, they felt like the benefits they got kind of overshadowed the risks they had. This was especially true with genetic testing. Almost nobody could sit down and tell me any real risks they thought were associated with genetic testing. And I think if I did the same interviews this year with the Golden State Killer publicity that we've had and just police uses of genetic databases in general, I'd see some different answers. And as I just finished with, not all data is created equal. People are much more concerned about this qualitative data than just kind of the factual demographic data. Okay, phase 2. I did an experimental survey. So I built upon some of the findings from the qualitative piece, and I created an experiment to test the effects of personal disclosure through social exchange theory. Most of the research in social exchange theory has been experimental in the last decade or two. So social exchange theory provides a theoretical framework for examining the outcome of negotiation by identifying the structural components that affect the exchange itself, which are trust and power. And so in this project, I wanted to isolate a direct negotiated exchange and measure the effects of negotiation itself. And that is study 1. And I did a second study, study 2, on assurances. And the 4 dependent variables that I measured in the study were first trust, a general sense of trustworthiness towards the company, and what I call encapsulated trust, which is, did I trust the company with my data? Fairness, so a sense of how fair they thought the relationship was to them and what benefits they gained. Questions around privacy, did they feel like they had control over their data? What did they think of the privacy practices of the company, and what were their general privacy expectations from the relationship? And then power in itself, generally who they thought was more powerful and who could control the terms, who held the power in negotiation. And so part of this was, I built on a 2013 study by Laura Brandemart, Alessandro Acquisti, who is one of our alums, and George Lowenstein, which they basically established a control paradox, as they called it, which is basically that as you gain more control over your personal disclosure, your propensity or your willingness to disclose increases. And inversely, as you lose control over information, you tend to want to disclose less. So they did an experiment that showed those results. And so the methods I used, it was a between subjects survey experiment. I ran it on Qualtrics using Prolific Academic as a recruitment vehicle. I had a total N of 770, paid everybody $3 for their participation. So the first study had 250 participants, and I ran it last September 2017. Study 2, 520 participants, ran it in November. And I basically presented people with a vignette about a fictional wearable device looking suspiciously like one of these things, AKA a Fitbit. It was a fixed price trade, meaning that I said, this fictional device would cost you $99. So there was no ambiguity about kind of what the company's incentives were. And I said it would collect the following information. Data about your body, heart rate, your steps, and so on. Location data, which is not something most of these devices do today independently. They can do it with their if you hook it up to a smartphone, but I said it basically was on all the time tracking your location. And then personal data. So mostly the data that you would need in order to buy the product and set up an account for the company. Your name, your email address, and so on. And then I controlled for the incentives, like why the company would do this. So I talked about what benefits it would actually give people for using it, what the potential security risk, or actually I tried to control for security risk by stating how the company protected your information, and made a point of saying that they did not engage in secondary uses. They did not sell it to other companies in order to kind of narrow the focus and control for potential confounds. So in study 1, the two independent variables, or the independent variables were two forms of negotiation, mandatory versus optional disclosure. And so the optional disclosure condition was essentially, you can choose the types of data about your body and your physical location, the Wear Me device, that's the name I gave this fake product, will track. And the mandatory disclosure condition was, you must allow the Wear Me to track all the data it requests about your body and your physical location. And so people were randomly assigned to one of these two conditions. And so I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hypotheses, which I will not read them to you, but I will summarize as my overall hypothesis, as articulated these as individual hypotheses, was that the optional disclosure condition would lead to higher participant ratings of fairness, trust, and power, and that the optional disclosure condition would also make respondents more comfortable in disclosing, meaning that it would increase their disclosure, just like the Brandemart-Christie study that I mentioned, and that would also meet their privacy expectations. The mediating factors that I included were just basic demographics, Gishi's trust and caution scale, to get a sense of, kind of mediate for the effect of one's trust or caution towards others. The information technology knowledge scale, to again get a sense of whether someone's technology kind of familiarity or knowledge contributes to any of these factors. And then privacy attitudes was a scale actually I developed myself based on existing privacy surveys that focused only on institutional information privacy. So there weren't questions about interpersonal privacy or how you engaged on social networks, for example. And then in terms of the vignette itself, I controlled for the sensitivity ratings that people gave for the type of information that the device collected. I had them rate different forms of assurance, had them kind of rate their perceptions of what the form of the exchange might be. I controlled for the influence of anonymizing the data and how that fed into their perceptions of risk, and whether they would use this or other devices. Whether they would use this device, as I described it, and whether they would use any kind of wearable device. Okay, so I did a series of bivariate comparisons, t-tests, and basically what I found was that 8 of the 9 hypotheses were supported at the 0.05 level or lower, and 1 was weakly supported, and that's the one in orange. And again, to summarize, so we don't have to read these all, this demonstrates that encouraging or constraining control over disclosure has a direct effect on the participants' perceptions of the relationship, as well as their willingness to disclose and their expectation of privacy. So giving them this negotiation power, the people in the disclosure optional condition had higher perceptions of trust toward the company. Their perceptions that the relationship was fair to them were also higher. They felt like they had more individual power, and they felt like they had more control over the terms of the relationship, as well as over their personal disclosure. And it also conformed with their privacy expectations. And basically, it weakly influenced their perception that they gained greater benefit from the exchange in the company. That's the hypothesis in orange. But in both groups on that one, the responses were well below the midpoint of the scale, which indicated that overall respondents felt like the company just fundamentally benefited more from the relationship that they did no matter what, which is actually a theme that we'll come back to in a few minutes. So the next step was to perform a series of regression analyses to get a little bit more insight into what factors might be contributing to these outcomes. So I had 4 models. Model 1 controlled for general privacy concerns, trust, caution, and technical competency, as I discussed earlier. Model 2 just controlled for demographic factors. Model 3 controlled for the vignette-specific factors that I mentioned, whether you're comfortable disclosing the company, whether you'd use that device if it were real. And then model 4, I basically went through and looked at the significant factors from the previous 3 models and ran a model with that one. I didn't do a kind of kitchen sink model where I put everything together in one, just because for the most part, I don't have any theoretical justification around demographics and privacy, for example. Okay, so to summarize, with trust, so trust was associated, or higher ratings on the trust variable were associated with respondents' lower concerns about privacy. The less concerned you were about privacy, the more you trusted the company. Their comfort with disclosure to the company, and the likelihood of using that wearable device. Those all contributed to people having higher ratings on trust. With regards to power, higher ratings of power were also associated with the optional disclosure condition, lower technical competency, greater trust, higher caution, lower general privacy, as well as higher income. That's the only dependent which income had any, it's the only one that had any demographic significant income was the only one that remained when you looked at all of them together, which I thought was really interesting because that's a sense that if I have more money, I feel like I have more power. Sure. Fairness, respondents' higher ratings of fairness were associated with optional disclosure, lower general privacy concerns, and comfort with disclosing to the company, as well as increased caution and one's willingness to wear the wearable device. With privacy, again, that optional disclosure condition had the strongest effect on people's willingness to disclose. So when you're in the optional condition, you disclose more information or you're more willing to. And the respondent ratings of the company's privacy practices and whether the company met their privacy expectations were also associated with a lower concern about privacy in general, as well as comfort with disclosing that data I mentioned before to the company, and whether you would use the product if it were real. Okay, study 2 will be very short because I didn't get very good results, and then we'll be done. Study 2, I looked at the following independent variables. I looked at 3 assurances, basically. A legal assurance, a formal assurance, where I said the device collected about you is protected by law. An informal assurance, which I called an indirect social one, which was over 1 million people use this device. So you can be assured because lots of people are using it. And an informal structural assurance based on anonymity, that your data is anonymized, so don't worry, you're one little point in a giant database. And so I broke this into 2 studies. The first one tested these assurances against the mandatory disclosure condition, and the second one tested them against the optional disclosure condition. And so these are the hypotheses, and I'm not going to go through them in detail because they were not supported. And let me just spend a minute saying why I think that's the case. So while assurances are typically understood to replace trust in negotiated exchanges, you still have to have some level of trust in order to facilitate exchange. So I hypothesized that some form of assurance would have a positive effect on trustworthiness and one's propensity to disclose information. And in general, So I thought in general that anonymity would actually win out over the other 2 assurances, just because based on the results from the qualitative piece, that people really did find a lot of assurance in anonymity. But it wasn't supported by the data. I had some very mixed results. A few things were significant, but across the whole, most weren't. And they were really mixed. There was no pattern as to this, it wasn't consistent that, anonymity was always higher, even if it wasn't significant. So when I ran the study, I started again with that mandatory disclosure condition, and I thought, I think one of the reasons why this maybe isn't working is that people just hate it. They don't like the mandatory disclosure condition. There's just I can't assure it enough. People just don't like it. So when I ran the second study, I was thinking, great, well, I'll run it against the optional one, and then we'll see that maybe there's some result, and it didn't work. Again, nothing conformed to my hypotheses, and there just wasn't any pattern in the results to say, even if it was weak, it's always that the legal assurance works. It was just the results were all over the place. So I think that there were a couple of reasons why. One is that there probably just wasn't enough risk present in the study. I'd kind of controlled for risk enough that there wasn't enough left to really make people feel like the assurances had any effect. So there were other questions that I had that demonstrated that people assumed that the company was actually following some level of responsible data practices. So again, there wasn't this question of what are they doing. Also, these might be not the right dependent variables to really think about how to measure assurance. So, and as I'll talk about more in a minute too, the participants were fairly cynical. And I'll show you some of the open response answers. In that they just assumed the company was going to do what they wanted to no matter what, and it didn't really matter what assurances you had. There are some pretty negative views about what these companies do. Also, these assurances may not be salient to decision making, meaning that at the time you're thinking these types of things through, these assurances may not actually be a good map to how your decision-making process is working. And I haven't really talked about Daniel Kahneman's System 1 versus System 2 thinking. Some of you probably know about that, but I'm not going to go into it in depth, just to say that we make a lot of privacy decisions most likely using System 1, meaning we're reactive, we're not thinking it through, we're kind of being impulsive, or making decisions at a very surface level, and that careful contemplation, that thinking about, is there a law? Will the law protect me? Is just not how we're actually making those decisions. Okay, so primary takeaways from the survey piece. Study 1 demonstrated that manipulating the terms of optional versus mandatory personal disclosure in a direct negotiated exchange did result in significantly higher ratings by participants of their perceptions of trust, fairness, power, and privacy when that disclosure was optional. In the regression analysis, what I found was that one's general attitudes towards privacy provided the most explanatory power across all the dependent variables. And it had a negative relationship, meaning that the more you trusted the company, or the more fair you thought the relationship was, the lower your privacy concerns actually were. But I have to note that the mean of the entire respondent pool in looking at general privacy was about 4.7 out of 7, so the midpoint would be 3.5. So in general, looking across the entire pool, this was a group of respondents that skewed towards being concerned about privacy. So even though their disclosure might have been higher when they had higher amounts of trust or felt things were fair, they weren't a group of people who didn't care, is what I'm trying to say. They actually did care. And then finally, I did replicate the core findings of the Brandemart-Acquisti study, which is that the more you increase the sense of control over disclosure, the more overall disclosure you'll see. Okay, so to finish up, the emergent themes I saw, one is that what this really tells me is that power is a really important piece of thinking about why people disclose. Companies do hold greater structural power, and I think you can see that in the comparison between the women using pregnancy apps versus all of us using Google. The more options you have to switch, the less lock-in you have, the lower switching costs. Those things all make a difference in whether you are tightly bound to a company and their services, whether you have the ability to actually switch and go somewhere else. That structural power allows these companies to really present you with non-negotiable terms. It's take it or leave it. And for most of us, we want the thing, we want the access to the service, so we're going to take it. Also, people's reliance on informal and structural assurances, I would argue, really suggests that institutional assurances are viewed as either co-opted, meaning that I don't really have faith they're really going to do anything. I think the companies have the power and control over the political system, or that they're difficult to access. And I'm going to bring that one up, back to that one in a second. But when I ask people, would you sue the company, for example, if you were upset with them? Most of them are like, how would I do that? How would I actually sue a company? Like, I can't afford an attorney. Like, how would I sue Facebook? So there's this sense that the kind of traditional ways, and also their faith in whether government can really act, fairly and beneficially regulate these companies, was very much lacking. They assumed, government's too slow, regulations don't work. I'm going to go to Twitter. I'm going to complain on Twitter. So, that's really where they saw they had the power to actually affect change. The length of the relationship really does make a difference in terms of how people perceive these relationships. And I think that's an important thing to say for privacy research, because so much of privacy is focused on the sign-up. We spend almost all our time researching when people first sign up for something, and we spend very little time following them, after that first moment where they disclose. And so the length of that relationship definitely, in the cases I looked at, leads to information asymmetries and these structural power differences. And then the 23andMe case, the indirect generalized exchange. In this case, at least, led to people really discounting the risk. They were just so enamored with the idea that they were helping the world that there was this sense of, what could go wrong? There was also a deep assumption, again, that they were not of interest to the company as individuals. They're just part of a large pool, and they're obscured by that, which could be true, although I had one participant who actually had a PhD, I think, in bioinformatics, and he had said, yeah, that's true, unless you have a terrible, rare genetic disease, and then suddenly you stick out. So, sure, you might be anonymous as long as you don't deviate from the norm or from the mean. I think that's an important point to remember. And there was just a perception that the large-scale pooling of data, not just in the 23andMe context, but really in multiple contexts, leads to a sense of greater good. People really have this faith of, I'll just be a point in the database, and when we gather all this data together, it's, they're doing it for good reasons, which I think is not always the case. Some of the emergent themes, some of the experimental work. So I think one way you could interpret these findings is that, if I just give people more choices, that's good for consumers, and they're going to disclose more. And so, if you follow the paradox of control kind of logic to the extreme, in order to encourage over-disclosure, you should give people as many options as possible. And that's similar to what I found here, which is I give you more power to negotiate. I'm going to find you more trustworthy. I think it's more fair. And I feel like I have more individual power, and I disclose more, or I'm willing to disclose more. But I would say an alternative interpretation would be that when you clearly articulate something like the mandatory disclosure condition that really requires maximal disclosure, people don't like it. And even when you're given more choice, people still find the underlying terms of the entire condition or the entire relationship objectionable. So I would put it like this. While consumers may appreciate having choices, having a choice between two unfair options does not address the underlying unfairness. So I think this dissertation, as well as other work, has made a case overall for the fact that people are not happy with where things are today. So just because you give them more choices doesn't address the fact that the power differentials are completely out of whack. So I would interpret something like the paradoxes of control not as an excuse to tell product designers, let's give people more control so they feel better about it, but as really a wake-up call to say, well, maybe we should actually consider constraining disclosure and not necessarily encouraging it to a maximum. Okay. We're just about done. And I realize we're just about done on the time. So very quickly, one of the other themes I mentioned earlier was that people were really cynical. And I guess this really speaks to that question of are we happy with the status quo? I would argue, no, we're not. These were a series of questions, and all I want to point out, because I know I'm running out of time, was just that these responses are ordered from the lowest level of agreement to the highest. And the question was basically, the company engages in these standard industry practices. What do you think standard industry practices are? And what I thought was notable was that the strongest practices were the ones that people rated the lowest. They just assumed, no, the company would never do that. But the ones that were kind of the weakest were the ones that people were like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a standard industry practice. Low expectations is how I'd summarize that. And this is just comments people made around on the same question. I asked them, what do you think a standard industry practice is if I didn't capture it in the previous question? And people said things like, purposely misleading the customer about how protected their personal information is a standard industry practice, and so on. So there's a fair amount of cynicism out there. So final thoughts. What does this contribute to privacy research? I would argue that social exchange theory is useful for understanding the power dynamics in personal disclosure. So I think recognizing that there are power dynamics in personal disclosure is a big thing. And it provides both predictive and explanatory power for kind of understanding phenomena that we've argued as just paradoxical. I would argue a lot of them aren't paradoxical. They make sense when you think about it in this different framing. In terms of how we contribute to, or how this contributes to social exchange theory, I would argue that it adds more work in the body of looking at information exchanges, because actually short of COI's fine work, there's not a lot of work on information exchanges. I do think one of the more interesting things, though, is that raises some really interesting questions about assurances, which I think if you look at the empirical research in social exchange theory, they've been mostly focused on saying there's a law or there's a guarantee, but there hasn't been much research into actually seeing how they work in the real world. Last point, in terms of like where this could go, what are the outcomes, this ran today in the New York Times. This was an opinion piece written by one of our most recent appointees to the Federal Trade Commission, where she's basically arguing that, in this case, this is a case against Apple, that if you buy an app from the App Store, you should have the ability to sue Apple. Right now, you can't. And so this is an acknowledgement that the structural inequalities between individuals and companies exist, and that, again, a body like the FTC is trying to rethink corporate power and how they rein it in, potentially through antitrust. And there are some ways we're seeing that manifest in other places, like the GDPR in Europe, and questions around data portability and whether you can opt in. But I think I made the earlier comment that if policymakers are only focused on kind of formal assurances, they're going to miss it, or they're going to really miss a world where they're like, great, we want to give consumers the power to sue, but if consumers don't have the money to sue or the means to sue, like working on that as an assurance is not all that helpful. And I think I'm going to stop there because I'm now over time and I want to be able to answer any questions. So I'll just leave the last slide up and say, are there questions? It was a dissertation, so there was a lot there. It wouldn't normally have made it that long. Thank you. My loyalty is still to Cal, just in case there's any questions.
Yeah, so this is outside of what you did. Of course, people will now start saying.
Right.
So I just bought a car, and I financed it. And so I knew that, they were going to ask me all of this information. Mm-hmm. And so salespeople know very well about incremental commitment. And so one issue is, at what point do you learn all of this? And how far are you into the process?
Right.
And so it was only after I had negotiated with several different dealers and this and that I get the paperwork that says, agree to mediation,
right,
binding mediation.
Yep.
And also I got a piece of paper that said, this is what we will do with your information, and this is what you can and cannot change. So it was only at the very end of the process. And furthermore, there was nothing on that piece of paper that told me how to go change anything I wanted to change. So at the point that I saw all of this, I was very far into the process, and I had no comparable information about any other dealer. So I had no idea. I had picked the car,
right,
so I had no idea whether other dealers for that same car company would be any different.
Right.
So at that point, I caved. But, I think this is part of the process also, is to kind of don't reveal until the person is so far into the process that they're really pretty much committed. Mm-hmm.
Totally agree.
Oh, and I'll add one more thing, and that is saliency. I have no idea if I'm in the Marriott thing because, I stay in Marriott once in a while. I probably signed up.
Right.
And I suspect that's the case with a lot of these data breaches, is that we don't know what we signed up for. We don't know what we agreed to. We don't remember.
Right. Nick.
Thanks, Jen. I'm learning a lot.
Cool. Thanks for coming.
I'm really interested in your negative finding in this assurances question.
Right.
I feel like there's a lot for us to learn there, and I'm wondering if you can maybe flesh it out a little bit different. What would be different if people did respond to assurances? Mm-hmm. what would the state of the world be if the level of formal or informal assurance changed as a direct negotiated exchange?
I feel like we could probably do a comparative study on a different country to get a sense of what it looks like when assurances work. I don't know if you're going, Yeah, I feel like I have embarrassingly bad knowledge about Europe, the EU in general, but I feel as if when I talk to European privacy people, there's a very different perception of, we always talk about the fact that the Europeans trust the government and don't trust companies, and it's the opposite for us. But I do feel like that comes from a place of feeling as if the government has your back in a way that I'm not sure we all necessarily feel here, at least on privacy. And the fact that privacy is considered a fundamental human right in the EU versus here. That said,
But you're
operation.
not just finding for the formal. You're not just finding for formal legal assurances. You found, right, or even the sort of informal, like.
Yeah, in the experimental
cues.
study, right. But the qualitative work, people absolutely, said. It was predominantly the informal assurances that they talked about. The formal ones required prodding. Usually I'd say, what made you trust, or what made you willing to do this? I could. I like the way the website looks. Who would you complain to? I would complain on Twitter. Would you complain to the government? I don't know. I don't know who I would complain to. That was, I tried to kind of gently take people through that. And when I would finally get to the end, do you know if there's any laws that would protect you? For the most part, it was like, no, or HIPAA, because it's health, or same thing happened with 23andMe too. I think there's a health law, and actually HIPAA, but there is GINA, which I did not discuss, Genetic Information Privacy Act, or Non-Disclosure Act. That was not maybe the clearest answer to your question, but I think maybe if we looked at different contexts to get a sense of what it looks like when we have maybe a more fully functioning regulatory system. Even in California, I would argue, where we have arguably the strongest privacy laws in our nation, and probably the most in terms of quantity, people still are very uninformed here, and from my experience, and they don't know that they would have to. Think about the new California privacy law, where if you want to engage, if you want to, what's the right wording? If you want to basically I can't come up with the right word. If you want to actually take advantage of that new law when it goes into effect, and you can't sue a company because you don't have a private right of action, but you'd have to basically contact the California Attorney General's office with your complaint, I guess is what I'm trying to get to. Most people aren't going to know that. It might be buried in the legal notice somewhere, if that law actually doesn't get preempted. But how would you know that? I think maybe looking at other contexts would be helpful, I guess, is the final. Ashwin? Yeah?
I was going to ask the different country question, but since that's been asked and answered, I will ask something else.
Okay.
Because I'd be very interested to know how your research plays out in different political, economic, and cultural contexts, as other experimental work in social exchange theory has done. But on the one hand, since you were so interested in consumer attitudes towards privacy, on the one hand, it feels like a great set of recommendations for policy and regulation that would come out of your work. But on the other hand, it feels like there is a very scary set of recommendations for corporations.
Right.
That could also flow out of your work.
Right.
And I was wondering if you've been in conversation with corporations, and if you haven't, what you think their reactions would be.
I have not. I've been more in discussions with regulators than corporations. Alessandro's work's been out there since 2013, right? And I think, one of the things I didn't spend time on this page, which I think has been his answer, which he wrote in 2015. If the goal of policy is to adequately protect privacy, as we believe it should be, then we need policies that protect individuals with minimal requirement of informed and rational decision-making, policies that include a baseline framework of protection. So I would argue even in this environment, we still need a baseline privacy law that prevents companies from taking advantage of our vulnerabilities. I think it's a controversial concept. Most people aren't kind of willing to admit that we're vulnerable in the ways that behavioral economics and other work like this suggests, but we're not capable of making decisions about the amount of information about us out there. As Nancy just mentioned, you're like, I don't know who I signed up with, and how am I supposed to be in control of all of these relationships when I have relationships with probably hundreds of companies. So how am I supposed to execute control over that in a way that puts it all on me? I would say it's mostly impossible.
Well, is that a scary outcome, or it almost seems like a virtuous one, the control point, that companies, if they want you to disclose information, are incentivized to provide you more
Right.
control. And it seems like from your view of privacy as control over our information, and in exchange to that, our incentives are aligned.
I need to think about that one. Get into that with you more afterwards.
One super quick question.
Yes.
What do you think? I would think about your incentives at the end. Assurances, and we've talked about this quite a bit. So normally I wouldn't ask a question, but I just can't help it.
Okay.
What do you think what do you think would happen if the assurances had more explicit bite? And what I mean by that is you ended with that slide, which I loved at the end, talking about the Apple example. And you're like, I don't know if this is the right path to go down because, people can't realistically sue these companies. And I agree with you. I think it's like, what is that really going to mean to me that I can sue the company? And yet, when I look back at your assurances and think about them, and I just wonder, in places that we know where assurances have been quite successful, in other exchange relationships, not in the privacy context, but in other contexts, in some of those cases, they have explicit bite. They say things like, here's the assurance, you'll get all of your money back.
Right.
Here's the assurance. You can get a $5,000 fine levied against, I'm thinking of things like the do not call list, which has its problems.
Right.
But I think a lot of the excitement around it came from the fact that people thought it had real bite, at least at first.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, in your view, like how the assurances could be modified, or if you think modifying them with more explicit bite would change any of the results.
Right. So I look at the GDPR, which just went into effect in May, which allows European regulators to levy, substantial fines in the billions of dollars, not just, I don't remember what Google was fined for Google Buzz. Do you remember, Deirdre? I mean, it was, small, right? There's been at least one case where a company's been fined by the FTC like $50,000. It might have even been something like Facebook, where you're like, that's, do they make that in a minute? It won't have any effect. But something like the GDPR, I would argue, is a warning shot for the companies. And so part of it is thinking, maybe parsing out what is assuring for the individuals. I mean, especially if the individuals are never going to be aware of the law. Like I have to kind of take on some level that there are definitely going to be people who care about it, but for the most part, most consumers probably are going to be oblivious. Unless we had a strong consumer protection agency where you knew you could report something and something would happen. When the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau first launched, I actually immediately sent something to them about my credit card company that I was angry about, and I got a response like that. And the credit card company responded almost immediately, and I was shocked. I was like, are you serious? I don't think that happens anymore, sadly, but I think that's kind of a case in point. It's like here's a watchdog that was well-funded and went out the gate doing what it was supposed to do, and then now we've seen it get slowly torn apart, and it becomes once again another kind of ineffective, co-opted regulatory agency. And don't want to say that I'm calling the FTC, for example, co-opted and weak, but I wouldn't imply that through what I'm saying. But just to say that I don't think we know what real enforcement looks like. And so if you had real enforcement, like actual proactive or reactive, such that I email something in and I actually hear back from them with a case number and a response, and that could make a real difference with consumers. But as it is, the FTC has a complaints form that I am not sure how anybody finds. People do find it, and people do complain to them, but I also don't know if they ever get a response. So, part of that is, I think, the regulatory agencies themselves making themselves more consumer-friendly, both in if they had the staffing to respond to people, but also in terms of, being a presence where people knew you could go to them. Most people just don't even know. So I think that would make a difference. But again, that's probably too abstract for a lot of consumers. So I would think we have to take it back down to what would actually make a difference in people's thinking. Which is why something like Twitter makes a difference, because anybody can get a Twitter account and they know, oh, I heard that, I got bumped or and they complained and they got a free upgrade. So it's I'm going to go complain on Twitter because I'll get a real effect. Something will actually happen. So that was a long way. Well, just in that, I don't know what we'd have to do, like what we could do to assure consumers versus, again, I think it's operating on two levels. It's like something like the GDPR, the companies take notice of because they could be fined heavily. I don't know if that really permeates people's brains. Will eventually, once they hear, oh wow, Facebook did something and they were fined $2 billion. Like that's big. Like that would actually show up on the front page of a newspaper versus that fine $50,000 for something. Like that makes people laugh, I think. Any other questions?
I have a question about the generalized indirect
Exchange. Yes.
Yeah, because it feels like you're suggesting, research is suggesting that there's a little bit of like a tranquilizer effect.
In this case, I don't
Right,
think that's...
that people feel it. Well, and it does feel like many companies are touting, oh, our data can do good, we can detect the flu, maybe not.
Right.
We can, use it for better transportation planning. We can do this, we can do that, right? This whole data for good. Look at all the insights, the novel insights. We'll be able to address health concerns. We'll be able to do all these things. And it sounds like talking that up or that sense of like doing something just for the greater good may take people away from the power differential that's being created between them and the company, which is kind of interesting, right? Because they both understand that it's everyone's data, right? So clearly they're gaining a lot of power.
Right.
And I just, like...
But it's not about you.
Yeah, but so how do we, should we be concerned about companies kind of softening the privacy blow by talking about, oh, but it's all for social good, or, if you were a regulator, how would you be thinking about that? It's kind of like the use of the word free.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, I think that, let's take 23andMe as the example, in that they hype the social good aspect of what they do. And there are definitely studies that are on, at least the last, they partner with public research institutions on different studies, but they also just partnered with GlaxoSmithKline to give them exclusive access to their database of users for drug development. And there is no guarantee that the drugs that are developed from any of you who are 23andMe users, well, like that you will directly benefit. And even if you had the disease that they developed the drug for, they're not obligated to give you the drug or to sell it at a cheaper price or to do anything. I mean, it's capitalism. They can do whatever they want. So maybe to the extent that companies are making claims about doing something for the social good, we should, either hold them to that or make them actually articulate kind of what piece of the social good it is that they're actually claiming. Like, I mean, you could argue that, it doesn't matter that it's capitalism and they're developing a drug that, works in a capitalist system and that they have to recoup their costs. And, oh, by the way, it's going to cost $100,000 a year to have access to it. Like, oh, well, but isn't that better than not having the drug at all? So I would argue maybe we need to think more carefully about, before you can make claims about you're really improving the world, tying that to something, or tying it to an obligation, such as, okay, you're going to work on, solving diabetes, should you actually have to donate some portion of the proceeds you make from that drug to some public fund or some sort of public support? I mean, just to throw some ideas out there. But I mean, I would agree with the line of thinking that you were on. Yes.
Hi, I'm Heidi Owens. I'm with the County of Santa Clara Privacy Office. I work with Yale, who is a colleague of yours. So shameless plug, we have a fellowship this summer. The deadline is January 4th to apply for that, and we need people. So I have two questions. For local, like city and county regulators, do you think there's any room for things we can do to address some of these concerns? And the second question is, do you think there is a place in the marketplace for a privacy app where a company goes out and understands these hundreds of different relationships with different corporations and automatically allows us to set our privacy settings to minimal, moderate, or maximum? Right.
Yeah, on the second piece, there's different versions of that idea that have been worked on, I would say, for the last 20 years. And I'm going to use the B word. Blockchain, I think, has revived some of the thinking on that. as a means of, could you decentralize personal information and allow people to control it themselves and use a mechanism like blockchain to help kind of the negotiation process? Or there are different startup ideas that are floating around in this space right now, including one by Tim Berners-Lee that I actually don't know a ton about, other people in the room may, around finding a way that people can manage their own personal information. I'm always a little skeptical of that because I think of it a lot the way most of us look at photos, which I credit Nancy for that work, which is, how many of us organize our photos? Like, really organize our photos? Like, are you going to spend time managing your personal information? Like, do you want to? I can tell you, I haven't organized my photos in 5 years. Like, I have a giant, giant, giant mess of digital photos, and they're not organized in any way. And sure, there are algorithms now and different programs that will help sort them for me, but for the most part, like, I just can't bear to deal with it. And I feel like personal information is going to fall into the same pool. There's a lot of thinking around, well, if we just give people the tools to manage it themselves, and now we have new technologies that will allow it, and we can give people the control back. I just don't think most people want it. So yes, could you delegate that? You could, I think, potentially. But there are other issues, I think, related to it, such as, do we actually own our personal data? I mean, it really is a compelling question. And I think there are answers on the kind of all sides of that issue, and I'm not going to get into it because we'll be here for a while. But so I would say it's interesting that blockchain, I think, has resuscitated a lot of the thinking on that right now, but I'm not sure it's still a good solution. What would the solution be? Maybe potentially restricting what's collected rather than just letting the universe keep expanding, into infinity. On the first question, can counties and cities do much in this space? Wasn't there just recently a proposition, or not proposition, but a ballot initiative in San Francisco that was related to data collection? I don't remember if it passed. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Aaron Peskin put it on the ballot. But it passed, it didn't do anything. Right, but wasn't it around, like, cities? The city can maybe follow some guidelines and passing some laws at some point. Okay, that big. I think that one way cities and counties could be active in this area is to be advocates on behalf of their residents when you engage in relationships. So take something like Ford Go Bikes, for example. Like, when you actually look at the contract that your city or county is signing with a provider like that, making sure that you demand, a certain amount of protection for your citizens. Yeah. So yeah, I think there are things you can do as a company, or I'm sorry, not as a company, as a city or a county in negotiating with vendors or service providers. As Nick was kind of pointing out, I'm not sure that passing a law will do anything at the city or county level, but yeah, Ashwin.
I'll put one data point that I know the University of California as a whole has a standard appendix that goes on almost all services contracts, which is a data security appendix, and it's standardized all contracts, so that might be something to consider in terms of budgeting.
Yeah, or if you make an agreement with a company to offer something like, I feel like there's leverage in that type of deal where you're like, well, okay, maybe it's free Wi-Fi, but you're not going to track everybody's data usage, for example. So, anybody else? You guys are in it for the long haul. It's 5:30. Yes?
Thank you. A question about kind of geographic distribution. Most of people that live in this area say somehow benefit from this kind of information economy. So if you would, let's say, I assume that most of the respondents were living in this area, or?
In the qualitative piece, yes. In the quantitative, the experimental survey, it was US-wide, so it wasn't local.
So maybe then the question on this US-wide part is that, did you see any difference, let's say, people from Idaho that are suffer from that information economy benefit here? How would we say more cynical or less cynical compared to the people living here?
I was not able to track people on a like state-by-state basis, unfortunately. So I don't actually know where in the US they were from. There's a lot of papers, I think, at this point arguing that the things like Mechanical Turk and to some extent Prolific Academic, which is the platform I used, are more or less kind of nationally representative in that there's enough diversity of respondents on there that you'd get a similar respondent pool as to what you might get if you actually did like a telephonic survey where you were sampling people from different parts of the country. But I don't have that level of detail of where they actually went. I didn't ask them. Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you, everybody, for coming.